Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another random review. Today's random review is my new film of the year. It's from 1965. It's from Japan. It's from Masumura, and it's Seisaku'S wife, starring the amazing Wakao, or Wakao, which again is probably not how you pronounce her name. She has rocketed up my big board of actors. She appeared in 20 Masumura films. A few months ago I did a video about actors with director collaborations of a sizable number, but at the time Wakao, I hadn't seen as many of her films with Masumura. I've still only seen like 12 Masumuras. I've got a few more in the backlog. But this is Seisaku'S wife from 1965, black and white, 93 minutes long. And as I say, it's now my film of the year. Masumura must also have the record for the number of films with the word wife in the title. So I have Seisaku'S wife, which we're talking about today. I have The Wife of Seishu Hanoka, which was almost going to be my film of the year. I've also have in the collection, and I have watched The Most Valuable Wife, again starring Wakao, and I have Two Wives. Well, I personally don't have two wives. I have the film Two Wives in my backlog as well. Also with Wakao, which I'll be watching fairly shortly. So I mean, he just has cornered the market on films with wife in the title, so sometimes it's easy to get confused which Masumura wife film you're actually watching. But again, let's get on to Seisaku'S wife. Again, written by Kaneto Shindo, who, for me, out of the films I've seen so far, has written the best Masumura films, with the exception of Red Angel. Shindo didn't write Red Angel, but he wrote The Wife of Seishu Hanoka, which is absolutely brilliant, and he wrote Manji, also starring Wakao, which is brilliant. As we know, he's a director as well. He did Onibaba and Kuroneko and The Naked Island, which might be his best that I've seen. But he also did a hell of a lot of writing for other directors as well. So this film, as I say, is now my new favourite film of the year. It's absolutely phenomenal. It takes place just before the Russia-Japan War, which lasted 1904 to 1905, and this was kind of fought over both countries interested in Manchuria. Japan had the smaller force and took more casualties, but they actually won. Big battle at Port Arthur, and Russia's loss kind of contributed to the Russian Revolution in 1905. So it's kind of set around that time, and the war plays a very important part in the film. So it's not obviously a war film like Red Angel, but it certainly has a lot to say about militarism and being a good soldier who just follows orders. So the film opens with 20-year-old Okane, played by Wakao, and she is married to a much older kimono maker. He owns a shop, and she's been essentially forced into marriage with him when she was 17. But strange enough, she's not very happy letting a lecherous old man lech on her, but it gives her mother and father money. Her younger son, oh my god, her younger brother was killed. So her mother prays constantly. Her dad, I cannot speak today. Her dad is in bed with a bad back, so they kind of rely on Okane's husband to give her money. It's not really a plot spoiler, but that marriage ends for a reason, and Okane comes back to her home village, where she's automatically kind of looked down upon because she's rich and she wanders about in kimonos while they're all working the fields and kind of poor and living day to day. So already the villagers don't really like her. But her next door neighbour son is Seisaku of the title, and there's a girl in the village who thinks that she's going to be married to Seisaku once he comes back from his military service, which he does. He's served his time and he comes back, and obviously he's welcomed by the rest of the town, and because he's done his military training and about order, he has had this bell made that he hits in a tree outside the village to get the whole village up and to kind of shake them loose of their laziness, if you will, and become more industrious, which some people like, some people don't like, but certainly Okane just can't stand it, and she's annoyed by him. But obviously over time you can kind of predict how this is going to go. War is then announced, and obviously Seisaku is going to get called up. So much to his sister and mother's disgust, and also the girl that thought she was going to marry him, even though he didn't really make any plans with her particularly, he decides to marry Okane because they've grown to love each other. I think that's the word that is more commonly used. But then he goes away to war, so she's left by herself with, again, the whole village looking down their nose at her. She brings her country bumpkin cousin, Haisuke, who is a bit slow, but he's an easygoing big boy. But because of missing Seisaku, Okane is just depressed and anxious. But they get a letter that he was injured at Port Arthur and he's in a hospital, and Okane wants to go, but the mother goes instead, much to Okane's disappointment and frustration. And then finally Seisaku comes home. He's been shot in the arm and shot in the leg, because he volunteered for a suicide mission, but obviously survived that suicide mission. So again, half of the village is calling him a hero, and half of the village are like, well, the only heroes are the ones that actually die, and it was a suicide mission, but strangely enough you've survived, so what's that all about? But Seisaku says he wants to get back as quickly as possible, which obviously upsets Wakao, because she doesn't want to be left on her own with these people. And that's where I'll leave the plot. But this is just a magnificent performance by Ayako Wakao as Wakao. Again, in other films, Wakao shows her versatility with humour and being bright and breezy, but she can also do the tragic stuff, which she certainly does to aplomb in Seisaku'S Wife, as well as obviously her performances in The Wife of Seisu Hanoka and Red Angel and Manji and all the other films. I've got a Nakadai and Wakao film ready to go as my next watch, so it'll be interesting to see her with Nakadai. The film looks gorgeous. This is beautiful pastoral shots by Masumura. I mean, it's baffling to me how Masumura is so underrated and underappreciated. Now, obviously, like 3 years ago, I didn't know who Masumura is, so it's a bit of a cheek for me to say that. But through Arrow, films like Red Angel and Giants and Toys, it just kind of shows you the depth of Japanese cinema when people like Okamoto and Gosha and Masumura are pretty much neglected. And there's almost parallels with me in Italian cinema. I'm not a huge fan of kind of the big Italian directors. I prefer the kind of Pietris and Monicellis and Petrangelis and Rossi. And same with Japan, obviously Osha and Mizoguchi I haven't really seen that many of. Mizoguchi I've just seen the big hits, if you like, and I've only seen 2 of Ozu's big hits. Whereas Gosha and Masumura and Okamoto and people like that are rocketing up my big board. So it's a film that is, even though, as I said, it's not a war film, but it is about militarism, it is about being a good soldier, volunteering for suicide missions. Who does that in their right mind? But obviously in war, you are dehumanised and brainwashed to run up that hill even though you're going to die. And it's like, okay, whereas any normal human being would just not run up that hill knowing that you're going to die. It just doesn't make any sense. It's also about mob culture and how it's easier to be part of a mob than being an individual. It's so hard to stand up against the mob rather than just join the mob. It's obviously about rich and poor. I mean, Okani was basically sold to this rich old merchant by her family, as was the way in Japan. It's not her fault that she ended up being treated to new kimonos and ended up getting money when that marriage ended. For a woman who's never really felt like proper love, again I think that's the word that people use, to then find it with Seisaku, you can understand why she doesn't want him to go to war when people again are saying the only heroes are the dead ones. So there's a lot going on in it. The third act is absolutely wonderful. It is off-putting because there is an actor who's in a couple of Masumura films that actually looks a bit like Peter Ustinov, and you can't get it out of your head once you see him. Again, one of kind of underrated heroes in the film is Heisuke, the country bumpkin, who's not very clever, if you want to put it that way. But he's a wonderful character as well. Again, Seisaku himself, to some extent is blinded by this kind of militaristic view and just follow orders, even though you're going on suicide missions and things like that. But his character goes through a process, and obviously Okani, she goes through a process as well. Again, you can understand Okani's parents' attitudes, you can understand Seisaku's mother and sister's attitude. You can understand the girl in the village who thought herself and Seisaku would be a thing when he would marry her. So it's a film that there's no real kind of heroes and villains, if you like. Yes, the villagers, are fairly nasty towards Okani, but again, you can kind of see their point of view, even though it doesn't really justify their actions. I guess nobody's actions in the film are completely justified, but again, you can kind of see everybody's point as well. Again, Masumura manages to make these films. None of Masumura's films, that I've seen, are like 2.5 hours long or anything. He does compact a lot of stuff in to like on average like 1.5 hour long films. I think like Fukasaku and all these guys who are making like a film a year or a film or sometimes multiple films a year, and they don't kind of get looked at the same way as like the big four in Japan are kind of looked at, which is a shame. And again, Masumura did lots of different kinds of films, so again, sometimes that gets held against you. And again, I've said before in Masumura videos that there is a critic on one of the Arrow releases that kind of said, Masumura had a purple patch, but before his purple patch and after his purple patch, it's not that interesting. And it's like, well, I'm 12 films into Masumura, and his worst film so far has been good. So as far as I'm concerned, it's all purple, with some absolute standout films, for me at least. Again, my opinion's not fact, but Red Angel, Giants and Toys, Irizumi, Seisaku's wife, and the wife of Seishu Hanoka are all top notch. They're all absolutely brilliant, and they really should be getting more exposure. Hopefully Radiance get to Masumura at some point, and obviously Arrow have released Black Test Car and Irizumi and Red Angel and Blind Beast. Blind Beast's fantastic as well. So if you can, I would highly recommend Seisaku's wife, and apologies to Ayako Wakao for constantly mispronouncing her name, because she is still alive. She's 90, and she's quite phenomenal. So thanks very much for watching my film of the year so far, Seisaku's wife, which I do a different pronunciation of the title every time, from Masumura in 1965. Please let me know if you've seen it and what you thought of it, and hopefully join me again for more random reviews. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.